What up? What up? I know I'm a little short, but I was just felt kind of comfortable down here. Is it cool to talk right here? Word, a little closer to the people. Feels nice. Word up. But I kind of got like a little bit of a lukewarm response. I'm one of those people who actually taught second grade, third grade, fourth grade, and so energy is really important. And so if I say like, "What's up? What up?" I kind of give like a lukewarm response. That's what I'm gonna give y'all back. So when I say "What's up," like give me what y'all want from me. If y'all want like a whack ass, conversation, then just say, "What up? What up? How we doing?" Yeah, thank you, thank you. Yeah, it's a conversation. It's a conversation, people. But yeah, my name is Kamau. Born and raised in Pittsburgh. I fly out tomorrow before the game. Don't act weird. Been in New York for about 11 years. And I'm always a little bit nervous before any conversation, even though I love to have them. And today's conversation is a little bit different than I planned because I just got back from, actually, let me go up a little bit. I can't see people in the back. I just came back from a conversation in Texas by the American Association of State and Local History, and I was asked to be a part of this talk a year ago. And the whole purpose of the conversation was to discuss monument removal in the United States. And so I walked into this conversation, it was packed, people were like filling up the sides, and within the course of like an hour and 15 minutes, the phrase white supremacy was used like 50 times. And it was like two black people in the audience, and it was me and Lonnie Bunch, who runs the museum, the Smithsonian in DC. And as I got up this morning, I meditate, I got my head clear, and I was like, I was planning to come here and talk principally about creativity as a form of manifestation, but I felt like somehow to go from that conversation in Texas about white supremacy and not just touch on that as a subtext with the work that I do would be like a missed opportunity. And so I began to like re-freak my presentation this morning. And so I want to have a conversation a little bit deeper than I initially planned, but I want to just kind of get somewhat of a collective permission to move forward. Can we step into a space that might be a little bit more awkward than just talking about pixels and vectors? Is that cool? All right, dig it. So long and the short of it is the Black Gotham experience is both art and history. It's fun. It's my personal American dream. We have cocktails, we do walking tours, we have music, because the story about black people in New York City, in many places, is not one of sadness, it's one of resiliency, it's something to be proud of, and so we approach it as very much that. It is a celebration. And so when you're talking about the black diaspora and how it's looked at and how it's contextualized, the reason why white supremacy is a subtext to it is because to talk about the black diaspora is to talk about the movement and transition of black bodies. And to not talk about what that looked like from a visceral standpoint and from the point of substance is to like not actually deal with the topic itself. And the reason why we started doing this project is because there's a lot of conversations about the black people in New York that somehow don't get discussed. Let me just begin this as a conversation early on. If you think about black people in New York and you want to go back far, how far can you go? What do you have in your mind that you've seen or consumed that give you a sense of what it's like to be black in New York? Anybody? 70s as far as 1918? Harlem, 1970s? Say it again? Harlem Renaissance. So that's like 1920s? How far back is that? We're going back like a century, right? But what if I told you that the very foundation to New York City was principally built by people that came from the Congo and Angola in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s? Where are those pictures at, right? And so part of what you begin to realize as you dig and dig and dig to talk about where are the black stories in New York, you see that visual abyss. And so I'm going to start with the unlikely slide to begin to dive in. So bear with me. It's not going to be too rocky, but it's going to be a little bit bumpy. But we're going to be fine. So I'm a grown-up, 42. I'll be 43 in October. And when I was in high school, about to graduate, I got Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's book, The ISIS Papers. Anybody ever heard of her? Hands up. Okay, dig it. She has a very fantastic framework that I began to look at when I was like 16, 17 years old to understand white supremacy and how it behaves. To try to look at how it operates in this context, just think about it as branding. It's behavior that can be violent, that can be detrimental to other people, but at the same time, it's ultimately a series of stories that make people think and act a particular way. Y'all feel me? Yes? Y'all, am I losing people? Okay. And so when you look at the way Black stories are represented, which stories are left out, which ones are talked about, a lot of that has to do with very intentional, curated stories that make you think a particular way. And to disrupt those narratives is to disrupt white supremacy itself. Because ultimately, as dangerous as it can be, maybe it's about the KKK or it's about, slavery itself, but ultimately it is a set of thinking that also can be manifest in people who aren't white. You with me? All right, just want to keep checking. So the framework that she gave that really worked for me is understanding how basically it's a set of thinking and ideas, which makes it a lot less spooky, a lot less loaded, and it's easy to talk about and unpack. And so this, once again, like I said, bumpy part, we're going right to outer space, right? Because now what I want you to think about is specifically like from, New York is my focal point for this. The reason why it's problematic to think about images and stories that are missing is what happens when you remove entire decades out of the conversation. Imagine if every day you lost your memory, how you could try to maintain friendships if you forget every day who you are and who you're talking to. And one thing that has been hiding in front of our face who might think New York is interesting or have heard of New York is this very impressive, large, gaping visual hole in the story of New York that really helps understand how bigotry and racism function in this country even more than understanding the South. Because one thing the North has always done is look down on the South like that's where slavery started, the South is bad, the North is good, and that's bull. It's total bullcrap. It goes back to branding. But the reason why the black hole is exciting is because if you are a creative and you do get the homework done and you understand what's not being talked about, that black hole isn't necessarily a problem. What is it? It's an opportunity. You can walk into that black hole, you can manifest something that's amazing, that is satisfying a need that's going to be valuable, not just in your particular time period, but also for the future. That's exciting. For me, that makes me have chills when I consider that part of what I'm creating with the Black Gotham experience is not just images for me and my friends to have a conversation about the 1640s, 1720s, 1770s, but these are legit artifacts that can be in museums in the future and be passed around to help create those bridges between different chasms of the Black experience. And so, another question. When you think about colonial America, what are some of the cities that come out into your mind that have been pretty well illustrated, reenacted in pop culture or artifacts? And don't worry, it's not a quiz. You're not going to get a grade. But what comes to mind? Virginia, Philadelphia, Boston, D.C., right? Some of these areas, you've seen some of the paintings, some of the etchings, right? So New York City, I don't know if you guys noticed or not, but this was our first capital for the United States of America. One of the biggest battles in the American Revolution happened right in Brooklyn across from Manhattan. And this is also where the Bill of Rights was signed and written during this time period. This is a very important point in the British Empire, which is why it was a focal point for George Washington, who's not from New York, but from Virginia, but came to New York on a regular basis because he knew that's where it was lit. He knew to come to New York, do his homework, ear to the ground, and find out how to begin to figure out how to mount an offensive against the British, because it was not done for the first time when he did it. He's not the first person to have the idea of galvanizing soldiers and fighting a guerrilla warfare against a superior enemy. And part of the reason why we have this missing history is because to actually show the history of New York from the first 100 years of this city, you would see a form of slavery that you've never probably ever imagined or seen in pop culture. Y'all still with me? When you think about slavery, what images come to mind? What's populated in your mind? I hear the South. What did I hear there? Cotton fields, ships, roots, Middle Passage, right? How do people look? I heard chains. All right, so that's what we've been consumed with. That's what we've seen, right? So imagine this. New York City which is named New York after somebody who's going to become King James II. But before King James II becomes king, you know what he was? He was a slave trader. His older brother, Charles II, created a proclamation giving him a monopoly on the English slave trade in 1662. The whole entire reason that New York becomes New York is because he's eyeballing this island as a perfect entry pole or commercial hub for something that's going to be called the transatlantic slave trade run by the English. If you've ever studied Black history, Middle Passage, you've probably heard of the Royal African Trading Company. And it was created by the king and his little brother, James Stewart, Duke of York. So New York City is actually named after a slave trader for the distinct purpose of being a commercial hub for the slave trade to get them down to the West Indies, Africa, and back to Europe quickly. It's a nice protected harbor by what we call Long Island, it's Brooklyn and Queens. And the reason why the whole story is kind of like twisted is because to see New York for what it is, you would see this entire island buzzing with Black bodies, around 20% of the population, making this entire wheel spin. And the people who are actually running this space called New York City is a skilled group of urban enslaved people that do not have any place in our visual memory, because to see them would problematize our concept of America, slavery, and our identity as citizens. Because this is a very busy port. There's 18 languages being spoken in New Amsterdam before it becomes New York in the 1640s. And so if you're a Black person in New York, numbering in the thousands, what kind of work do you do? You're working on the docks. You're building roads. You're building City Hall. You're building Trinity Church. You are a very skilled worker and more than likely have to be literate to actually function as an urban slave in this century. And you very well likely be a polyglot or speak multiple languages, because the people who they're going to buy these enslaved Africans need them to run the business sector of New York City, because even back then, it was a financial center. You follow where I'm going with this? What's going to begin to happen in the 1600s, going into the 1700s, is people begin to realize they're not liking slavery too much, especially considering there's an entire Black population that began to get free before New York City was ever created. That also creates this whole new vision of what life can be like if you have free Black people that own farms and have cattle and animals, etc. And so the point that I'm trying to tease out before going to the next slide is part of the reason why New York City has this missing century is because it presents Black life in a way that doesn't flow into this idea of people that are enslaved having no language, not understanding their identity or where they come from. And God bless everybody who ever went through that experience, but this is another counterpoint that really shows how worse slavery got for Black people once we became the land of the free. And that challenges us to consider, why did it get worse once we became Americans versus being subjects of the British? And so this is something that hasn't been done. And so once again, it's a black hole. What do you do with that black hole? You fill it, you populate it, but it begins to make you think about how powerful storytelling is, because you have a whole new identity that's been waiting to be tapped into to help us have more insight about our current situations. Have you ever heard somebody say, this is our country, we built it, you came here? You know, we're having those same dialogues right now, right? But that's just basically branding. The same way New York is a brand, and you don't think that New York actually has more to do with slavery than any place in the South, because New York's been involved in the slave trade since the 1664. You follow? Am I boring you yet? Y'all with me? I know it's a history lesson, but that's part of what inspires the artwork, because that's what I like to do, is blend the visuals with the art and the history, because the person who made that map was an artist. The people who paint things that we look at and put our gloves on and celebrate as these very glorious things that help us understand the past, they're creatives. And so right now, part of what we have the power to do is not just talk about things that we don't like or things we don't want to see, but we have the opportunity to manifest what we want to see versus complaining about what's in front of us that we do not like. And so this is a graphic novel project I'm working on with some of my buddies. We're taking the whole story going from 1625 all the way up to 1883 in a series of stories that are both walking tours and graphic novels. And so we're depicting these narratives in a visceral sense so people can get a better idea of what it was like to be there, not to quote unquote humanize people, but to already show the humanity and the power that people had in order to get through something that wasn't just taken away when Abraham Lincoln said slavery's not cool anymore. You have to actually follow the entire process and see how all the dots connect to see how people of color have always resisted and pushed back on the system. Nothing was just handed over to us. And of course, there's allies and people working together to make it happen, but part of what's happened is you get this idea that somehow everybody was enslaved, never complained about anything until the Stamp Act is passed, then we have a revolution, and then everybody else doesn't complain until you have Abraham Lincoln, and that's also gives you this idea that somehow black folks didn't fight against the system and throw their bodies at it, when actually they were the first ones to do it before it became more attractive after 1765. And so part of how we're doing this project, which is historic but also artistic, is using photography as a principal method. And what that allows us to do is take perhaps somebody in this room and say, hey, how about you play this particular character from the past? Work with a fashion designer, dress you up, bring it to the studio, take the pictures, and then bring it into a format that can be illustrated and designed that becomes a two-dimensional experience, but the entire process is 360 degrees of art and creativity that gives you a chance to not just study history, but be a part of it. And so now, by filling in that black hole, we're creating a whole new set of experiences that give each individual that's a part of this a chance to be a part of history, to be a part of healing, and to have some fun and get paid while they're doing it. And so this is just the beginning of our whole idea. The person over here to the right, that's my man named Charles. He's a stylist from Chicago, lives in Brooklyn, and he plays a character of a guy named Domingo who becomes a landowner in 1643, gets 12 acres before there is a New York. It's the town of New Amsterdam when the area is run by the Dutch. And he's having an actual dream in a sequence on a slave ship that's going to be attacked by pirates that then bring their bodies to New York. And in the second frame, one of his friends is passing on during the whole transatlantic slave trade going to Manhattan. And part of what we're trying to do here is animate and give some sense of fantasy of what's it like to have a soul. No matter what's going on with your body, you still have a soul. You still dream. You still have to die. You still have ideas of where you're going to go when you do pass on. And so the goal here is to make that illustrated so you can kind of get a sense of what it's like versus just say, oh yeah, they're all slaves on the ship, and not kind of deal with the humanity of it. This frame right here also shows how we're taking illustrations and people and putting them together. And this is actually somebody having a dream about a wolf. Once again, middle passage, and somebody else who appears as an angel in a dream. And we're looking at just taking creativity and approaching a very painful subject matter, but looking at it in a different light. So we have more angles to look at it and appreciate it. And this right here is something that I think is just worth looking at, is by stepping into this space, we're addressing something I call monumental silence, where you walk into spaces that might have actually been built by somebody black, like Broadway or Wall Street, or go to the Museum of the American Indian that actually once was a fort that was set on fire by a guy named Kwaku as a form of arson in 1741. All that history is not talked about. And so you walk in, you could walk around New York City and probably other places. Just curious, anybody here live in a city where somebody black did something very important that's not quite acknowledged where it is? People are laughing like, yeah, that's a regular thing. And so part of what we're looking at being able to do with the walking tours and the graphic novels is talk about the context of spaces so people have a better understanding of what happened there to make that part of the conversation, not just be upset about what's in front of us, but begin to add the conversation, add new elements. This is actually where the slave market was on Wall Street, and there's a plaque about a block down from that. And the reason why the plaque is not where it belongs is because the person who owns the property didn't want to have a slave market plaque on his property, and so he just didn't answer the phone calls from City Hall, and so now the slave market plaque is a block away, which is fine. I guess that's his right, but once again, if this was somebody else's history, that plaque would probably be right there. But instead, we have this monumental silence where you don't quite know, walking down Wall Street, who built Wall Street and for what purpose. And here's one of my least favorites. Anybody ever heard of Sam Francis? I don't know if anybody have any history buffs in here besides myself, but he's a person that George Washington actually was connecting with when he came to New York, and he actually funded the early revolutionary activity the Sons of Neptune became the Sons of Liberty that went into the Boston Tea Party. This is a black person who basically came from, more than likely, from Saint-Domingue, and most historians acknowledge him as being a person of color. And if you go to Philadelphia, they have reenactments of him on Independence Hall that show that he was clearly a person of color. But when you go to actual San Francis Tavern, they got a picture of George Washington on the front, and when you walk inside, the first thing they show you is a denial of the fact he could possibly be of color. But every historian acknowledges he's a person of color, but the reason why they're attacking his identity is because putting a black person at the epicenter of the American Revolution challenges all those paintings and drawings that take black folks out of it. But meanwhile, come to find out through my research, black folks have been at the epicenter of the revolution before it even became an idea, because who's more upset, somebody over taxes in 1765 or somebody upset about being enslaved in 1720, 1710? What's going to piss you off more, slavery or taxes? And so for hundreds of years, people act like somehow the main thing that got it lit was taxes. But that's not what the facts bear out. What the facts bear out is that there were intelligent black people in New York, a very prominent port city that spoke different languages, that were literate, that lived in the mansions with their masters, because so much like New Orleans, that's how the quarters were. And they basically were able to organize and talk about having rebellions. And the first one happened in 1712, the second one 1741, and they all got stamped out, but it began to show the whole process and the possibility of organizing and fighting a war that's not supposed to be won with guerrilla tactics. And if you connect all those dots between Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, Suriname, New York City, South Carolina, what you see is a continuation of military tactics being developed by people that are enslaved to fight against slavery. And by the time the Stamp Act is passed, people got a blueprint. It's almost like somebody taking away 100 years of history right now and showing Macklemore and saying he made hip hop. Now, no one's going to deny that Macklemore got bars, right? I think he got bars. I ain't mad at him. Eminem can rap too. But if you take away all the history prior to them and don't show, Bambaataa or Kool Herc and just say, yo, they started rapping, just show them with the microphone in the crowd, it's like, word, that's hip hop. It's like, yeah, that's hip hop, but they ain't started though. This exact same thing that happened with our stories of how revolution became popular and led to this new movement in this hemisphere. And it's very important to understand how that plays into storytelling and branding and ideas of white supremacy, because it's not just about violence. A lot of ideas about white supremacy is just a set of mythology and thinking that often makes you behave in a way that becomes real predictable. And it's not just one particular group that has white supremacy on the brain. Black folks got it too. We often don't support each other, don't believe in ourselves, and are afraid to manifest our dreams because we believe somehow we don't win. We believe that somehow we had the Kool-Aid so many years that it's like, and I mean mental Kool-Aid, not actual Kool-Aid. We believe that somehow what's inside of our brains, what's inside of our dreams don't come true, And so it's great to be around people who are, sharing their ideas of manifesting creatively. I just wanted to give you guys a chance to think about historically when you talk about manifesting and black imagination and people of color having dreams, that things like freedom itself, things like the whole idea, we the people, the idea like freedom or death might be given to Patrick Henry, but somebody lived that before he said that. And it's important to appreciate that as a person of color in this hemisphere, to understand that a lot of the things that have been, dreams of people that look just like you have manifested into countries, into nations. And that legacy has been denied to you by making you think that somehow somebody gave it to you. It's a lie. It's not true. So part of our ability as artists, as creators, is to use our capacity to think and to manifest and add to the story. Not just complain what's there, but change the narrative by using your creative power to think and to be creative and intelligent and just tell the story the right way. Don't be mad someone else didn't do it. Do it yourself, you know what I mean? So I think I have like 2 minutes, is that right? One of my favorite big monumental silences is here on Wall Street. This is called Federal Hall. I'm going to give you something to take a look at later on, but please Google on your own time. I don't have time to get into it now. It's called the Great Negro Plot. It happened in 1741. It was a 6-month court case, New York Supreme Court, and there's nowhere in this building that acknowledges that ever took place. They have an entire timeline that talks about everything that happened in this building, and they skip an entire decade not to mention this information. And it's well known, well documented. But once again, it's the wrong story, right place. And so here's my last minute. Part of what I think is important to understand about storytelling and manifesting and ideas of identity is the reason why I do what I do is because I was actually working at a museum in 2008, and I was giving stories of European immigrant history at the Tenement Museum on Lower East Side, and I found as a black person having those kind of conversations empowered to talk about the nuance of identity, and I had a good time with it. I love people, I love stories, and so if it's a Jewish story, German story, Italian story, it's all good. Let's have a conversation. But I found myself in 2008 with a school group, and after talking for 90 minutes, one of the students, a young girl actually, about 12 years old, she raised her hand and was like, had one final question. And I was like, yes, what's your question? And she was like, where are the black people at? It just blew me away because I was not conscious of my own blackness. And I was born Samuel. I love that name, but I chose Kamau when I was like high school. I organized a walkout for Rodney King. I read ISIS papers my senior year. I love black culture. And I love other cultures as well, but I feel great in my blackness. But in that moment, for 90 minutes, I had an all-black school group, didn't mention black history once. And when she called me out, I was so proud of her, but also felt forever changed and decided I'm not going to be that person talking to anybody and not find a way to weave in these powerful black narratives that I had an inkling of. And so I think that anybody in here that's young, under the age of 21, or whatever your story is, I think that if it wasn't for that little girl having a chance to actually push herself to challenge an adult, I wouldn't be having the life that I'm living right now. And I get a chance to do a lot of cool stuff. We have the largest public art display in Financial District right now we put up. I did it as a regular citizen, not even as an organization. We have a space in the Seaport District. We have conversations, and I give free tours for teenagers on a regular basis to share this history back with them because they're the ones who asked for it in the first place. And so I'm going to close it out there, hopefully right on time, and just ask you guys to continue to think about the power of manifesting your visions. Thank you for your time.
So I know you all have some questions, but I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask a question. I said I'm going to take a point of privilege and ask the first question. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the irony of your work in the financial district with Wall Street and talking about the transatlantic slave trade?
Your name again? Melissa, thank you. Great question. The way I define irony is the truth you didn't see. So when people say something's ironic, what it really means is like, I ain't thinking about that. And so what I look at is the power of place and the power of vision. And I like to think that I'm not afraid of what I want because sometimes the thing you want wants you back. And so think big. And so I'm walking around Wall Street and the financial district for like years talking about the history that's not down there. And I'm thinking to myself the whole time, how dope would it be to actually be in the same footprint as people who built these streets, who aren't acknowledged, and to have a spot to talk about these and powerful stories, which is in and of itself a political statement. And so, I've been able to get support from people who say, you know what you're doing is interesting. How can we help? And I think it's also valid to say that the world is not against you because you're black and have radical ideas. I mean, the Department of Transportation is not a black organization. That's the government, The organization that runs the Seaport District, they're a white company. You go to their website, they're hella white, But people love history, and they like to do nerd out. And so we have a conversation and can run the gamut, what century, name a decade, let's go. And they say, you know what? I'd like to help you do what you do. I think what you're doing is cool. I say, word, thanks. Graphic novels are cool. Walking tours are cool. It's like, word, let's go. Okay, boom. And people walk by our spot now and see these pictures of like black people etched on the glass, and they kind of sneak in and say, do white folks know you're here? And it's like, white folks know it's okay. Walking tour tonight. It's not scary, you know what I mean? And so I think being in a financial district is appropriate because black folks have been down there longer than, New York has been New York. Or America's been in America. And so to talk about those stories in the location where it took place is a powerful conversation. And so it's intentional to be there. And when some folks say, why aren't you in Harlem? It's like Harlem got, Harlem's being held down. They got Starnberg, they got the Studio Museum, but no one's like down Lower Manhattan on Wall Street saying, by the way, somebody from not a random Africa that's like abstract, it's like one place, but like a very specific part of Africa, a very specific tribe, kingdom, had people taken from ships, headed one place and end up here, and they built the foundation to this town, Wall Street, Broadway, the fort, the church, etc. And so I think it's valuable to be down there. So I hope I didn't answer too long, but it's intentional to be at the place where it's not acknowledged and speak truth to those spaces.
Thank you. One of the huge problems in the traditional model of comic books is kind of the engine of graphic novels is very corporate. People are underpaid, all those things, but also representation. Some of the early African American comic book characters were super characterizations of or with caricatures, of what a white guy thought black culture was. How do you plan to tackle publishing? You're tackling that representation very well. Do you plan to publish yourself? Do you plan to go to the traditional publishing markets? Is this also part of your mission?
You answered all the questions. Thank you. It's been in the back of my mind to create a publishing company for a couple years, and just for like a timeline standpoint, 2010 was my first walking tour. The idea to do a graphic novel came in 2013, and then 2015 I did a Kickstarter, and I promised my Kickstarter backers that in 2 years the first book would be out, and my plan was to go the route of getting an agent, then getting a publisher, and then rocking from there. But as I kept telling a narrative about black people becoming landowners in the 1640s and black folks organizing rebellions in 1712 before George Washington was born, I began to think to myself, what would they do? And it was just kind of like loud and clear, like, bro, do it yourself. And so I was like, all right. And so, I'm going about it in a manner where the first chapter is going to come out through my photography studio. And I'm talking to a number of people to create a publishing company called Black Gotham Press that's going to roll out the graphic novel series as well as other forms of media. And I'm talking to Christina Norman, not just trying to name drop, but she's a powerful sis who ran MTV for a while, worked for Oprah for a minute, and she's come on a walking tour, and she's like, dude, we're doing a documentary. What's up with a web series? I'm going to make phone calls. It's like, word. So that's the media company. So the idea is to create an opportunity to give opportunities versus have a conversation with a publisher that says, I think there should be a white person on the cover, Kamau. I know how you feel, but, I think that for the Canada version, it needs to be George Washington. I can't have that conversation. I'll lose it. And so I'd rather do it the slow route and just say, you know what, let's actually, raise the bread and create what can very well be a powerful vehicle, not only for myself, but for other people who have ideas they want to get out and aren't going to have it watered down because they're afraid of how it's going to be seen by some data that was crunched because they don't have the foresight to just follow their heart. So yeah, that is part of the mission. Yes, sir.
Another question? Can you just speak up?
What do you recommend when working with young people? Because I used to work in the school system, and so much of, if not all of the literature is dominated with a Eurocentric, explicit or implicit bias. And so all of these narratives about America and the founding and the Civil War are all completely dominated by this culture, which you kind of are forced to follow, to comply. And even though you can tell alternate narratives, you don't have the power to change the system. So what do you recommend in terms of, literature and access and opportunity, especially for our, young men and women of color, to help them understand and own these stories and then even be exposed to them, which I think is a very strong challenge.
The question is about exposure and how to deal with inspiring young people around these visual stories that aren't, where they are consuming material that doesn't reflect who they are. I would say one, I'm gonna give you my card because I have some resources for you, and there are a number of different voices coming into the comic game and the graphic novel game that really are refreshing. There's a reason why Spider-Man is being rebooted and Iron Man is now Iron Woman. You know, like there's a pushback on creating different types of superheroes and concept of superheroes as well. But I would say that the short and most, deepest cut that you could take into the process is just be very candid with your students about that problem and let them create their own characters. Let them be those characters. Because part of what people who love comics can relate to is you want to be Tony Stark, as Ghostface, People read those books and want to be that person. And so part of what I'm looking at doing is asking people like, hey, will you be so-and-so? And then allowing them to bring that ancestor and bring it forward in a way that's creative but also visually dope. And so you could ask the exact same thing to your students and say, create a comic book character based on someone in your family. Will you play that person? And give them a chance to dress up and use photography, which is inexpensive, to be that. And that way, you're addressing a problem in a very deep way and can add in all kinds of oral history. They can interview people and say, what if your grandma had a superpower? What would it be? So, go right into the problem of identity and make them base it on themselves. And I think you'll get some awesome stories.
I'm getting the chopping block. I'm sorry. Give a round of applause.